anniversary this week. Man. 6 years with this wonderful woman over here. Very grateful for her. Give her a hand because she's the one who's got to be married to me. And Kijana had a birthday on the same day, so thank God for that. Thank God for keeping everybody. Oldest grandson. 22, 23. 23.
Don't take that from me.
Getting old. Yep. But thank God for having blessed us and for having kept us. There's some folks that Carlise told me she couldn't be here today, and so I knew she wouldn't be out. But we're going to get into this. We got a lot of stuff to get into, a lot of material to go over. Might not get through all of it this week. If not, we'll pick it up at another date. Before we get into the material that we wrote out, though, I want to deal with something that I don't think I did a very good job with last week, and that was one of your questions. You asked last week, how do you know if God is speaking? And I tried to, in a short period of time off the top of my head, give you something to help with that. But the more I thought back about it, I didn't really feel like I did that question justice. So I want to touch back on that and deal with how we know that God is speaking to us, or if God is speaking to us. And one of the things I told you was that sometimes you don't know. There is a process of relating and understanding things. There's sometimes where God will speak to you, or God will do something to get your attention, and it's big and it's obvious. You're driving across, or you're driving on the highway, you hit a sheet of ice and there's 6 lanes and you end up on the other side of the road, spin around and going the other way, and nobody touched you. Well, somebody might say that that's luck, but those of us who don't believe in luck would say that that's God, and that was God's way of trying to get your attention, or God's protection, and that was God working on your behalf. Right? So there's the big stuff, but then there's also the small things where sometimes you think it's God and you're not sure. And that you figure out by trial and error. Sometimes you think God is telling you to do something and you do it and it works, or it doesn't work, and you figure out, okay, well, maybe that wasn't God. Sometimes God's telling you not to do something and you do it anyway, it blows up in your face, and you realize that voice that in the back of your head, maybe you should have listened to that. It's a learning process. So initially, we recognize God in the big things. As you learn over time and as you interact with God more, and you bump your head, and sometimes you think it's him and you try something and it doesn't work, and you're like, well, maybe that wasn't him. You start to understand, you start to figure it out over time. And by studying him and trying to learn who he is and getting to know him, that's the other side of it, is that the more you know and understand who God is, the easier it becomes to understand and recognize his voice. So there's not a clear-cut always answer to that question, which is why it was difficult to deal with. But it's a process. Learning that and being able to understand and recognize that is a process, and it takes time to go through. And that's the best way that I can explain, or the best answer that I can give to that. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we've got, like I said, a lot to go through and a lot to cover. I'm not going to go through the normal process that I go through of reviewing everything that we've been over, because there's way too much stuff to talk about and way too much stuff to deal with. And while I'm thinking about it, you going to be here next week, next Sunday? Okay, we'll deal with that, with your question that you asked me about the Old Testament and everything on next Sunday. We'll start hitting that. Okay? So divine communication, like we said, it's never been a straightforward proposition. It's always been shrouded in mystery throughout human history. That's been particularly challenging since the Enlightenment age, where both secular and religious Western cultures turned away from mysticism towards a scientific basis. So in human history, we've always worked, we've talked about the fact that since the beginning of civilization, people have tried to interact with gods. People have tried to communicate with divine beings, and there's always been a mysticism or a mystery around it. There were rituals people didn't understand. You do this, and all of a sudden, either by magic or by mysticism, whatever your faith was, poof, something happened. In the Enlightenment age, we got away from that throughout history. The Enlightenment was 1400, 1300. 1300s, 1400s, Western society moved away from mysticism and mystical culture and mystical belief and turned towards science and philosophy. And that became the underwriting paradigm that we looked at everything from. And we tried to understand the world instead of through, we'll say, superstition or through things that we didn't understand, to trying to use the sciences to understand reality around us. Anything that cannot be poked, prodded, measured, or dissected has been pushed away from the mainstream and relegated to fantasy. So because we're such a scientific community now, because we're so science and philosophy driven, if I can't see it, if I can't measure it, if I can't test it, if I can't sit there and dissect it, we say it's all fluff. There's nothing real to it. Our reality became confined to that which we could see, touch, feel, smell, and that's what made things real. Ironically, in spite of centuries of poking, prodding, measuring, and dissecting, there's still a lot of things about reality that we don't know, a lot of things that elude human understanding. So as technologically advanced as we've gotten, there's still a lot of stuff there's still a lot of questions that technology can't answer. They thought the atom was the smallest particle. Then they came to understand that there were protons and neutrons. And then they came to understand that protons and neutrons had quarks. And then there were positive spin particles, negative spin particles, quantum physics. And in spite of all of the technology, there's still things about the physical universe that we exist in and experiences that people have that science can't quite grasp. Consequently, as technology demonstrated its limitations, scientists started to return to the study of the mystical and applied modern scientific method to help understand ancient knowledge and ritual. So in the Enlightenment age, we abandoned ritualistic, mystical, magical, whatever we want to call it, culture. As science progressed and they started to see the limitations, some scientists started to, hey, look at him.
Oh,
the baby's here.
yeah, why?
Ezra or Ezekiel? Ezra, okay. As they start to realize the limitations, some scientists start to look back at the mystical phenomenons that had been dismissed and try to apply scientific technology, scientific method to see if they could understand things that pure science by itself couldn't measure. And that's where we find ourselves, where some of the things that we find ourselves discussing come from today. They go back and study the scientific or the mystical culture using modern understanding to try to figure out what's going on. The fusion of these disciplines has provided a framework through which the process of divine communication can be understood in a manner that is more acceptable to the Western world. In order to understand the models, though, and apply it to our own spiritual experience, we have to work on understanding the language, principles, and discipline of these models. So you're talking about a lot of very heavy, involved material that if you're not careful about how you approach it, you'll end up messed up in left field, not really understanding what the conclusions were if you don't understand the process and how they came about understanding these things. Now, this discussion here is going to be a lot more informational, a lot more conceptual, and eventually we'll be able to tie this back into biblical relationships. But for the time being, we're talking about what they've understood by studying voodoo, by studying ancient Indian religions, by studying transcendental meditation, and what the experiences that these people have reported in their cultures and what the rituals look like and what they've been able to come up with to make sense out of science on a scientific basis, or more of a scientific basis. How do we blend the two ideas? First thing that we're going to deal with is two words, emic and etic. Those are in your study guides, emic versus etic perspectives. The terms emic and etic are two different viewpoints from which a person studies human behavior. Etic is a view from outside the system under study. Emic is a view from within the system under study. So we look back, if we want to study African American slave culture, we're outside the culture. That would be an etic perspective or an etic study if we were to take our tools and look at it from outside the culture. If you were to talk to somebody that experienced slavery or a slave at the time, that's emic, because that comes from within. And sometimes, as you guys know, what you experience as an outsider looking at it and what you experience in the middle of it can be different. Both viewpoints or approaches are an integral part of the discipline of cross-cultural psychology. In an etic study of a culture or cultural practice, a person will use modern cultural concepts to analyze foreign cultures. For example, a feminist in 2015 America who studies 1950s America using etic methods will draw certain conclusions about that culture based on current social thought. 2015 feminist looks at 1950s society. They're going to draw certain conclusions based on the way that we understand the world to be now. They'll characterize the culture in certain ways based on the way that we understand the culture now. Her conclusions might be vastly different from the perspective of a housewife in 1954. So somebody living there, somebody dealing with it, would have a different perspective in the moment. That's the difference between emic perspectives and etic perspectives. Where this comes into view, where this becomes relevant for what we're dealing with, is that a person in 2015 studying through an emic system will try to understand the culture as experienced by a housewife in 1954. Their perspective is likely to be more consistent with the women experiencing the society. So when we're trying to describe phenomenon in other cultures, we can take a look at the phenomenon from our perspective, from our cultural point of view. That's an outsider's point of view. If you really want to understand what's going on, though, you have to try to figure out how to relate the world as they saw it to the world as we see it today. So we'll say, using the feminist example, somebody will say that women were oppressed in 1950 because all they could do was be barefoot and pregnant. You ask a woman in 1950 if she was oppressed, she might not feel the same way about it, but we have a completely different cultural and social standard that we operate by now. There's no objective way to include which perspective is factually correct, though. So the woman in 1950 sees it one way. We in 2015 see it a different way. Who's right? Both, neither. There's no objective scientific way of being able to measure that, because we're talking about trying to deal with science and not opinion, or research and study and not opinion and perspective. But anthropological disciplines aren't necessarily worried about being factual in their propositions. We're worried about being accurate in the way that we understand things. So whether the woman was oppressed or isn't oppressed, when we're trying to study that culture and how things go, isn't really the question. The question is, can we model or understand that in as accurate of a way as possible? That's part of the discipline of what these sciences are developing. Accordingly, conventional models of comparative study look for the overlap between the etic perspective of modern culture and the emic perspective of the culture being studied. From such an overlap emerges an analog through which foreign phenomena can be understood. So in other words, the way that people that do this for a living professionally do it is that they've come up with models where they take a look at how we understand it today, how would they have understood it before, where's the overlap between the two? If you take them, if there is an overlap between the two, then we can come up with an analog that will accurately describe what's going on from our perspective that's still true to the way that they understood it. If there is no overlap, that means that the two phenomena are just so separated that we're not really going to get and understand how they looked at it, because our culture is so different that there's no common basis through which you can have a conversation or study. Okay? So, for example, I think in the back of your charts, I should really learn to start. Yeah, in the back of your study guides, I should really learn to print these things out so that way I can look at them too. You've got a chart that I pulled from one of my research materials. In that chart, you have two different categories. On the left, you've got imposed edict perspectives. On the right side of it, you have emic perspectives. This was taken out of a book this is a model developed actually back in the 70s, and we've evolved. The science has progressed since then. But this takes a look at how would we explain a spiritual experience versus how they explained the spiritual experience when they were dealing with it. If somebody says that they heard a voice telling them to do something, we would explain it based on hypnosis, disassociation, fear, attention, biochemical agents. Maybe they were high, and that's where the voice came from. Maybe they were sick. If they were sick, maybe they had a fever. If they were sick, maybe they were sick and crazy. This is the model that we would use to explain any of those phenomena. That's what's known as an etic perspective. The emic perspective breaks down an entirely different system of explanations. And so the overlap between the two, if the overlap exists, is where we find a way of trying to bridge the science and the mysticism. And we'll deal with a little bit more of this chart later, but if you can take anything that any church person says that they experienced in church. I got the Holy Ghost. I had an out-of-body experience. I was slain in the spirit. Any of those things that we talk about that happened in church. Or, I don't know if anybody ever watched Walker, Texas Ranger while it was on.
Yeah.
But Walker would go on his spirit journeys. And he'd encounter his animal spirit, whatever it was. You take that ritual and that practice, we're going to explain it based on the perspective from the left, because that's where we come from. They'd explain it based on the perspective of the right. Segal and other specialists in cross-cultural psychology point out that modern Western psychology is a monocultural science, so integrally bound to Western culture and values as to be nearly useless for application in other cultures. So we take a look at this stuff, and we only understand our culture. We are very ethnocentric. It's the nature of the beast. We understand, and we think that because it's scientific, that means that's what it is. We don't think about the fact that science is a progressive process, and that what was scientifically true 200 years ago is not necessarily scientifically true now. We still base our reality on a proposition that science explains all of it. It doesn't take the worldview and the culture of other regions into account when we explain these things. So it's very, very difficult to take our tools and understand what's going on for a Tibetan monk who spends hours in meditation and what they're experiencing and what they claim happens when they're doing that. If this is the case in the contemporary scene, it is even more pronounced if one were to take models such as the Myers-Briggs profile or the Enneagram and use them to understand ancient Mediterranean persons in ancient literary reports. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Assessment, MMP2. It's one that sometimes counselors will give to people. We've got all these tools, like I said, to poke, prod, dissect, and measure reality around us. If we can't even translate that across cultures to another culture now, when you look at ancient literature, like the Bible, or a Talmud, or Quran, to understand what they were describing, these tools end up creating anachronistic and ethnocentric. Anachronistic means complete removed from time. What we apply modern standards and modern perspectives and interpret it based on a way that they couldn't have seen the world. That's not really relevant. I'll explain it to somebody later if they have any questions about it. But you end up making mistakes and tripping over your own culture trying to understand their culture. Disciplines like anthropological psychology and models based on this kind of research offer far more suitable tools for analyzing the ancients in reliable cross-cultural fashion. So we're talking about trying to come up with models for understanding mystical or spiritual rituals. The science of it is that they try to find, like I said, they try to find the overlap. They try to understand how would we see it today, because the first thing you need to know when you're researching something is your own bias. The first thing that you need to know, truthfully, when you're, and we'll get to this at some point in time, when you're reading the Bible or you're reading scripture to try to understand it, to try to discern God, to try to hear from God, the first thing that you have to be aware of is what your own biases and predispositions are. So that way you have some kind of idea, are the conclusions that I'm drawing, am I seeing this because I want to see it, or am I seeing this because that's what's actually there? We bring everybody, nobody, and did I skip that picture? Does it not print out? Maybe I got rid of it. Everybody knows, even these people who research this stuff know that nobody just comes with a blank slate to these things. Everybody brings a background, everybody brings a bias, everybody brings a past and a perspective that they tend to think things are from. If you're not aware of that, then you're not necessarily going to be true to what they saw and what they experienced, because your own opinions are going to color the way that you see what you read. So you have to know what your bias is, then you learn what their bias is. And just because their bias said a specific thing doesn't necessarily mean that that's what was true, but we have to understand the world as they saw it if we're going to be able to understand what truth is supposed to come out of that. So it's always important as we deal with, honestly, it's really a life lesson in dealing with other cultures. As much as it is a academic or scientific lesson, you have to know what your own biases are when you deal with people. You have to know what your own biases are when you deal with other cultures, and you have to understand what your own biases are when you go to study God's word or interact with God. How do I know the difference between my own voice and God's voice? I'm praying, I'm asking God something, and something comes to me that seems like it works perfectly well. How do I know if this isn't just what I'm hearing because it's what I want to hear, as opposed to God speaking to me? It begins with knowing the truth about where you are, what's going on in your head, where this stuff is coming from, what emotional baggage is attached to it, what psychological processes are attached to it, and am I looking for God to lead me, or am I looking for God to affirm what I want to have happen? Big difference. Am I looking for God to lead me or direct me and speak to me, or am I just looking for him to tell me I can do what I want to do? You got to know where you are. You have to be honest enough with yourself to know where you are, so that way when he does speak, or when something comes to mind, you know how to question it. And there's nothing wrong with asking questions. You think God's speaking? Okay, well, let me ask. Let me ask for confirmation. Let me ask for affirmation. Let me give this time, as opposed to jumping at it, because I actually want this, and I want to make sure that what I do isn't just me. Or I'm getting a negative answer, and I want to make sure that this isn't my own insecurities poking through when God is actually telling me it's okay to do it. Know your own biases. So from those studies, these people have developed an understanding of alternate states of consciousness, which we began to deal with last week. You read about people going on vision quests, people having out-of-body experiences, people hearing the voice of God. And what does it all mean? How do all of those things transpire? What do those phenomena look like from a scientific basis, as opposed to trying to use science to discredit and say that it didn't happen? Let's assume for a second that maybe there's more going on than what we can measure. Let's see what's going on with people. And we talked about, and I'm not going to go back over all of it today, but by hooking people up to EEGs, by hooking people up to EKGs, by measuring chemical levels within the bloodstream at the time that a shaman is experiencing whatever it is that they're experiencing, or a witch doctor is doing whatever they're doing. And we're talking about like 25 years of study here by neurologists, by medical doctors who it started to become clear that the body is hardwired to be able to experience reality in different levels and in different ways. Our central nervous system, and I think I told you, it was 489 cultures that they studied, and 90% of them all had ritualized practices that regarded spiritual experiences, not to mention people that are just high-functioning individuals, high-level athletes, people that are particularly talented in doing something. You study the way that they operate, you study the way that their body operates, you study what their baseline neurology looks like. What do their brain waves look like when they're not doing this stuff? What do their brain waves look like when they're in their zone? It becomes clear that the body can experience reality in a different way. Time goes faster, time slows down. different things that are going around you. You don't hear them. The body's functioning fine, but the neurological processes are altered. And you see, you feel, you experience time, space, and reality differently. Noises become louder or things become dimmer. It's different than what you normally experience. And these are all considered alternate states of consciousness. And the reason that they're called alternate is because they're different from the baseline and they're different from the norms of what everybody else experiences. Just your normal basic stress, fight or flight reaction could be categorized as one of them, because when you are in a fight or flight moment, everything seems brighter, everything seems louder, your reaction times start to speed up, and there are chemical processes that induce that. But what you see and what you experience is different than what everybody else is seeing and experiencing. So that way, if I'm driving in a tunnel underneath the ocean, I'm just saying that if I'm driving in a tunnel underneath the ocean and it's perfectly fine for me, somebody else thinks it takes a half hour to get through there and we're about to crash into a wall because there's a different brain activity process going on at the moment. Alternate states of consciousness.
I don't know who he's talking about.
So,
You got it.
so the science is pretty clear about it. And I brought some of the source material I have down here. This one, The Mystical Mind, Probing Biology of Religious Experience. This is kind of one of the definitive pieces of work written by Eugene DeQuilly and Andrew Newberg, who, like I said, were both neurologists and medical MD, PhD, and I'm an MD. They're the ones who did a lot of this groundwork and studying them and their contemporaries. They've been studying this stuff for 25 years. This came out in 2000, so they've been doing research since 1975, understanding. And like, it's not a Christian text. This is just human culture and what they experience and what they deal with. So we know and we understand these things do happen. The brain operates differently. Now, that does not mean that every single alternate state of consciousness means that you're going to have a spiritual experience, that you're going to have a vision. I know, for example, when I used to sell shoes. I went to New Jersey, I sold women's shoes, sold women's shoes here. You got a good sale going on. You've got 15, 20 different women that you're dealing with at any given time, wanting 5, 6 different pairs of shoes. Things get hectic. You get into a zone, you're going back and forth. You just grabbing stuff and doing things. I don't know if you've ever dealt with this when you were working the floor at a restaurant, to where you're just zoned in and you move quicker, things click, and things get done, and you don't necessarily know what your day was like and what just happened. It was just over with.
Yeah.
But people were thrilled with the way that you did your job, and you were so good at stuff, and they're trying to compliment you, and your brain's already on the next pair of shoes you got to grab. You shift gears, your mind shifts gears. So there's a difference between alternate state of consciousness and spiritual encounters. And so I gave you guys as a specific, or on one of the pages, 6 principles of alternate states of consciousness and spiritual experiences. These are just general working guidelines to be able to understand what we're talking about and be able to differentiate what's the difference between me just being in a zone and me having a supernatural experience. The first one, the human psyche has an inherent ability to experience and interpret both consensual and alternate realities. The proposition of that being, as we've talked about, everybody, and at one point we thought, spiritual folks thought that you had to be a special person to be able to experience alternate states of reality, or to be able to have a vision, or be able to have a dream. Anybody can enter into an alternate state of consciousness. I use 2 terms there, consensual and alternate realities in that first one. Those are actual technical terms. Consensual reality is your physical universe. Alternate reality is something that can exist parallel to consensual reality, which would include the metaphysical universe. So you've got consensual reality. That's what everybody sees and experiences at the same time. If 5 minutes passes, all of us would look at our watches, and we would measure the time, would say 5 minutes passed. It's a completely agreed upon, normalized way of understanding the physical world. A alternate reality is what a person will experience when they are in an alternate state of consciousness. They experience time going faster. They say that was only 5 minutes, it felt like it was 2 hours, or it was 5 minutes, it felt like it was a half hour, it felt like I just got here. Within that realm of different or alternate states of alternate experiences exists the metaphysical or the invisible phenomenon that happen that people can't feel and touch and see and understand. Every alternate state experience is not inherently spiritual, but spiritual encounters are understood to occur within alternate states of consciousness. So we just talked about that. Everything that somebody experiences, just because somebody gets hyped doesn't mean that they're having a spiritual experience. But spiritual experiences or encounters where people hear voices, where people claim to encounter specific things, we understand them to happen within an alternate state. I want to clarify what I mean by that, because as I read this stuff and I looked at the way that these people dealt with things, especially from a biblical perspective, they tend to ride that hobby horse pretty hard. They want to explain everything that happened in scripture as a result of an alternate state of consciousness. Every time something caught fire, every time there was a cloud, every time they were alternate states of consciousness. Now, academics have a tendency to do that. They'll go back and redefine everything that existed since in every culture in terms of what their new discovery is. But we can't necessarily objectively say that a spirit can make itself manifested in physical reality. We can't measure that. If we're talking about having a scientific perspective on these things, we can't say for sure, because we can't measure it and poke it and prod it and dissect it, that an angel can make itself manifested physically in physical space. We don't know. So the only thing that we have to go on is to say that these things happen within an alternate state because everybody else has experienced it, and we don't know what angel, demon, jinn, imp, whatever it was that you want to call this thing, we don't know what they can and can't do. So we assume or we understand that these things tend to happen within alternate states. Is that necessarily absolutely true? We don't know. We can't say definitively one way or another, but we analyze it from the standpoint of saying that these things happen within an alternate state of consciousness. All alternate state experiences are perceived through conscious or subconscious cognitive mechanisms. So you have an alternate state experience, your brain is what actually is producing, is interpreting the experiences. Okay, so it's not, what you experience is not detached from your own biology or from your own anatomy or from your own physiology. It's actually you physically going through things, whether you're having a dream and it's a subconscious cognitive mechanism, or you're having a waking experience, your brain processes these things. It's your brain actually doing it. ASCs, as perceived through cognitive mechanisms, are processed on the basis of social, cultural, and psychological predispositions, aka latent discourse. This one's big. This one's big because basically what this means is that when we when we experience an alternate state, what we see and what we interpret comes from a cultural predisposition or background. Everybody's culture, they bring their own understanding of the world into what they experience when they're in that state. So somebody claims to have a vision. The things that they see and the way that they interpret things all come from what they've already previously understood the world to be. If I understand that the stars are gods and I'm having a vision, then when I start to, and I'm having an alternate state experience, then if I see stars, I'm going to believe that these are gods that I'm seeing. Whatever it is that I see, however it is I experience things, they're all based on the cues of what I've previously believed and understood the world to be. And that's complicated for us because we don't have anything to work off of. Our culture does not have this. We're in the 10% that does not have a ritualized, culturalized, systematized way of understanding spiritual phenomenon around us. There's some people that if they have a dream and there's water, that culture knows what it means. Then they know what they're seeing. And they bring that into what they're seeing and what they're understanding. One of the, and I didn't take the time to really get into this, but one of the things that Felicitas Goodman talks about is that in a lot of these experiences that you see in scripture, it starts with somebody seeing a bright light. And then after they see a bright light, then they start to see other things around them. And then they start to hear things. There's a process that you see that happens a lot of times when people are experiencing these things. They say that tendency continues to manifest itself in other cultures, where there's first a light or some kind of dissociative, some kind of sensory overload. And then they start to see physical something, and then they start to hear things. And what they say and what they believe is that the culture that you're coming out of fills in the gaps once you start to see the light. And you start to have this experience. And one of the things that we first talked about is that God interacts with people on the level of where they are and where they are within their culture. So a person over in India can have a specific culture. God interacts with them. They see a specific set of things based on what they bring what their culture brings to it. Somebody over in Africa, over in Zimbabwe, over in, somewhere, they have a vision. They're going to bring their own cultural perspective. So what they see in India and what they see in Zimbabwe may be two different things, but God is still interacting with people on the basis of their cultural experience if they're having a spiritual experience. So when we go into these things, one of the reasons why we have a hard time with this in this country is that we don't have anything to really work off of. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Questions so far?
You were talking about how people within the culture will have something happen in the altered state.
Mm-hmm.
Is that sort of like when people dream of fish and they just assume it's a pregnancy, somebody's going to end up pregnant? Because
they've got a pattern of dreaming of fish and then somebody ends up pregnant. Yeah.
Okay.
We try to piece together and make sense out of what's going on. And yeah, that's one of the things, that's a good example of that. The next one, spiritual encounters and events are only perceivable to those who are in a place and time to experience them. We've kind of touched on that in where we talk about having sacred times and sacred spaces, but it also means that a person who has a spiritual encounter may have that, what's the best way to explain this? If you're not in an altered state, you may not see and experience what everybody else is seeing and experiencing. Or if you have a group of people that exist within a state, they may all see or experience something similar. And because there's also such thing, we've talked about this on an individual level. There's also such a thing as having a bunch of people in an altered state, and I'm going to end up doubling back on this when we get further along. You have a group of people in an altered state. They all have a similar experience. They all report similar things. They may not, because they're all in the same state, but somebody else who may be there and not in an altered state may not see or experience it. So bringing this to modern examples in the church, you have a church full of people. You have 5, 10, 15 people in the church that exist in an altered state. You got 40, 50 people in the church that aren't in an altered state at the time. Those 15, 20 people might see and encounter something that the rest of them don't, because they're not in a place where they can experience it, even though they're in the same physical location, which explains a lot of things that go on in churches sometimes.
But it doesn't mean that the person is off or wrong. It's just that they're not in the same altered state.
Right.
Okay.
Now, when we come back to the next lesson, when we talk about rituals and we talk about liturgy, a church service, and we don't understand it in these terms. We'll say a religious service, to take it out of the church realm. A lot of religious services are designed, I can't say they were designed it, but without knowing it, the construct and the ritual can usher people into an alternate state. And you could say that the services are designed to allow that, except they didn't know that that's what they were doing. But it takes you in an alternate state. We used to use terminology like get outside yourself. We didn't know this, but that's the language that we use to try to explain. The service is supposed to bring you into an altered state to where you can have a spiritual experience, and some people just either aren't receptive to it, aren't compliant. They got other things they're thinking about. They got other things that are going on there. And so when, in theory, when you hear people talk about putting everything else out your mind, focus on what's going on, they didn't necessarily, I'm not saying that this is what they knew that they were doing, but the general concept and the way that it works is that when people do that, they can be in a place where they are more receptive to experiencing something. The last point, The psychological, psychiatric, and neurological disciplines can provide a framework through which ASCs and spiritual encounters can be studied. So one of the things that we talked about, what's the difference between somebody who's crazy and somebody who's having a vision? Is there a difference? There's absolutely a difference. Because we're talking about altered states of consciousness. I put a bipolar or psychopathic or sociopathic mind is in fact impaired. And any symptoms that are produced or any symptoms that they have related to that do actually come from that dysfunction. So because we're no longer divorcing spirit from the physical and the psychological, a crazy person is crazy. They're not spiritual, and they're actually hearing voices. Those aren't there is an actual neurological process. They are hearing voices. But even a crazy person has a baseline brain function. You can hook them up, and there will be a baseline that they operate. And when if their brain shifts gears, for whatever reason, whatever the stimulus is, there's an alternate state there. And can a crazy person in an alternate state having a spiritual encounter? Yeah. Are they going to know the difference? Will we know the difference? Probably not. It may be a little bit tough to be able to differentiate what's going on. But we can't say that everybody that has a vision is having a vision and not having an hallucination. There are such things as hallucinations. The question is, what's the baseline and what's the derivation from the baseline? Is this person's impaired brain is still impaired? And so when you look at the chart and people want to explain, there are some people whose experiences fall into the category of neuropathy. There's something wrong with the way their brain's wired and they're experiencing all kind of crazy stuff. You take their baseline, that's where their baseline is, and you measure what changes occur as stimulus as they're stimulated. That manifests their altered state, or that they do go into an altered state. But we can't dismiss psychiatry and psychology because people exist in an alternate state and just say, well, they're not crazy, they just have an altered state. No, they're crazy. When you take the crazy person, you find their baseline, and then you determine whether or not what they're experiencing is in a state or not. And that's kind of the science to it. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of where's the overlap between psychology and psychiatry and spirituality or mysticism. The last thing, and I didn't think I was going to get through all of this, so I'm going to touch on this quickly, and we'll end up picking it up more next time we get together. That we have to, well, I might talk about the natural versus the supernatural, how we understand it versus how they understood it. Ethnographic literature throughout the studies that have been done report two emic explanations for spiritual experiences over and over again. A person is either possessed by a spirit entity, which is possession belief, on the chart that I gave you when we have a spiritual experience. There's two explanations that come up over and over again. A person is either possessed by a spiritual entity or one's own soul or experiences things, sometimes, but not always, as a result of an encounter with that spirit. The Spirit of God came mightily on Samson, and he tore a lion to pieces with his bare hand. Again, the Spirit of God came mightily on Saul, and he prophesied among the band of prophets. The Spirit came upon Mary, and she became pregnant. These experiences reflect a possession belief and would be categorized in a model as basically a positive experience of spiritual presence. So people who encounter spiritual phenomenon either say something happened to their spirit or a spirit came on them. That's the way that they continually explain it within their cultures. Two elements that all of these sample societies hold in common are, number one, a belief in the existence of invisible spirits, and number two, a ritualized, that is, traditional way of interacting with these spirits, which people learn through their respective cultures. Since spirits belong to the supernatural realm, we once called the emic understanding supernaturalistic. In contrast, such a supernatural premise, when such a supernatural premise is lacking, they call it a natural approach. A man named Ludwig offered a good example of the naturalistic explanation. He identified 5 types of ASCs according to the way in which they are induced. Each type consists of a dozen or more forms, so the total is more than 60. So a supernaturalistic explanation would blame it on spirits. A naturalistic explanation would say that the body is experiencing an alternate state. Yet the contrast between supernaturalistic and naturalistic is no longer valid or useful, Benson Saylor has demonstrated that this distinction is a Western culturally determined concept. So we talk about supernatural and natural. For a while, the people that were doing this science define things in terms of supernatural and natural. Along comes a guy named Benson Sawyer, and he demonstrates through his work that supernatural and natural distinctions are something that exist within our culture. That's not the way that they understood it from an Enoch perspective back then. There is no word in the New Testament, the early patristic writings, or liturgical text that can be correctly translated or glossed supernatural. Christian thinkers up to the 5th century did not really develop the theological significant uses of supernatural. It was the translation of the works of Pseudo-Dionysius into Latin in the 9th century that introduced supernatural into the theology of Western Christendom. So our conversation, the way we look at the world, we got natural and supernatural. That's something that we've introduced into the conversation over as the culture evolved, but it's not necessarily a definitive line to where all the angels are on and all the invisible stuff is supernatural and everything that we experience is on the natural. That's our way of distinguishing things. Instead, the major distinction for the ancients was between the creator and creation. Creation included not only human beings and all other items we would call natural, but also angels and demons, which we would call supernatural or spiritual. Saylor concludes, the supernatural then is our culture-bound category for anything that transcends the eminently principled operations of nature as we understand them. Folk usage of the term supernatural makes it include God, angels, miracles, prodigies, powers activated by spiritual rituals and spells, and in general, a wide variety of preternatural items. Saylor observes that it is this folk understanding of supernatural rather than the theological sense that appears most commonly among anthropologists. So, whereas we define the world in supernatural and natural, that's not necessarily the way that the rest of the world that experiences these spiritual disciplines differentiates their world. They see there's a creator and then there's all of creation. All of creation includes everything we see and everything that we don't see. And that's the way that they delineate the world. This presents an opportunity for us to examine the paradigm that we understand the dual reality. Most people, and let me move through this a little bit. So we understand, let's talk about Christians and Westerners for a second. We understand supernatural and natural. We have an understanding. We talk about God dispatches his angels to come to us, that God will step down into your situation. We create through our language a barrier that has to be traversed in order for a person to be able to experience a supernatural event. What this other model presents is the possibility that maybe we're not as disconnected from these things that we can't see as we think we are. That maybe we exist in the same time and the same space as angels, as the heavenly hosts, cherubim, seraphim, all those things that we read about and talk about in the Bible that are invisible. Maybe there's not a separation. Maybe they exist in the exact same space that we're in on a constant basis. You talk about practicing the presence of God, realizing that God is omnipresent, that we are constantly in his presence. There's some people that will say that I need to go to church that way I can get into the presence of God, whereas somebody else may realize that I am always in the presence of God, and I can view my reality and understand my world as though God does not have to dispatch an angel to come down from heaven to deal with my situation. I'm walking amongst them now. It's a different way and a different possibility for the way of viewing the world that we live in. And time. You talk about second births. You talk about people being born again, born of water, born of spirit. We see ourselves as physical beings that exist in a physical plane. Very few of us entertain the idea that we might exist, that we do exist by nature of our second birth in a dualistic state. Might be a little bit spacey for some folks, but this is another perspective to understand that we share space with angels. We share space with God, that our reality is not just touch, feel, No, but there is the stuff that we don't see, we can experience exist with us. And so then the question becomes, is that true or not? Because I just presented it as a possibility. And that's something everybody has to decide for themselves. Part of faith is deciding what you believe about the reality under which you exist, and then testing it to see if it's true or not, if it works or not. If it doesn't work, then you make your adjustments. If it turns out to be false, you make your adjustments. But if we're going to communicate with God, if we're going to say that God is a God that communicates with people, then we have to make some decisions about what we believe regarding the world that we live in and the nature of the world we live in. Are we separated from spiritual realms by this void that has to be traversed? And he may not come when you want him, but he'll be there right on time, even though he's always everywhere. How do we entertain? How do we entertain our reality? How do we process that? Do we believe that we live in the presence of God, that we live with the ability to interact with spiritual beings and phenomena? Or do we believe that when you go into an alternate state, you are piercing into another world? You got to figure that out on your own. I can't give you the answers to that, but you at least need to know that the conversation exists. So that way you can try to figure it out. The next time we get together, there was a question that Raquel asked that I'm going to take the time to deal with. So we're going to take a break from this and deal with the question, is the Old Testament still relevant to Christians or still relevant today? And if it is relevant, how do we know which parts of the Old Testament we follow, we don't follow, or what we just say, well, because Jesus is here now, we don't have to follow no more. We're going to take some time and deal with that, and try to at least give you, I can give you my answer, and I think my answer is the right answer, but at the very least I can give you some things to consider to actually have an informed conversation that is comprehensive on it. And so that's what we're going to deal with. When we come back to this, we're going to wrap up the ASC, the alternate state conversation, with examining the rituals that exist within religions and how going back to consecration, how being consecrated can put us in a place to where we can experience God's presence. How does this whole thing work? I might get into some of the neurology of it, talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems and those kind of things. I'm not going to get real heavy into that because that's not, I got issues, so I'm not going to get real heavy into that, but we're going to talk about some of those things so that we actually are knowledgeable of that and hopefully be able to tie that into our spiritual experiences and how we can hear God's voice, and what that means for us, and explain why on the mountain did Moses hear a voice, everybody else just heard thunder. We're going to deal with that. So that is the conclusion of the lesson for today. I think Carmen's going to give us a little bit of information on the book bag, the school bag giveaway that we're going to be doing. Question. Okay. School bag giveaway. So she's going to update us on